Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
As I dropped them off, I waited to see them get into the school. And sure enough, from a distance, I saw that my son had appeared to have been stopped by a teacher. I saw him start to cry, and they had forced a mask on his face, even though the teacher was holding the medical note in her hand. So I drove up there. I got out of my car, and the teacher put her hands up into the air and was like, I didn't do anything. Within about 20 minutes, a police officer pulled up to the school. And what I had learned is that the principal had called the police officer and claimed harassment when I told the police officer all I wanted was my daughter. And if they had answered the phone, if they had answered the buzzer, they would have known that.
Just to point out how insane this is, it takes a police officer to have a child removed from school by their parent.
Yeah.
Like that's where we're at with the education system now, is that the police have to be called if you want to pick your child up from school.
Yes. And that's what I found. I told the police officer that this is ridiculous, that all I wanted was my daughter down because I was concerned for her safety. And the principal clearly, seems to have a personal opinion tied into this.
Yeah.
And that she is capable of anything. She was capable of lying to the police officer about the policies. For any parents also that are going through the same thing, I want to tell them too that they need to fight for their kids, and that they're ultimately the only ones that know their children best, and to not take any discrimination or bullying from their schools. We need to keep our children safe from any harm, even if at this point the harm is coming from the people who we are supposed to trust with them daily.
For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini, feeling like a broken record as we see continual disregard for mask exceptions, and now specifically within the school system for very young children. Today, I'm bringing you the story of a mom of two, her name is Melissa Chaponi, whose children attend Our Lady of Grace Catholic Elementary School in Angus, Ontario. That falls within the Simcoe-Muskoka District Catholic School Board, and only recently have they had their mask exemptions denied. Despite having no issues since the fall of 2020, upon their return to school on February 8th, all of a sudden, there seemed to be a problem. Here is what Melissa had to say.
Back in September, it was not mandated for any grades lower than grade 4 to show proof of any mask exemption. It just recently, as of February 8th, when they went back, there was that they needed a medical exemption note. So when I had called the school asking for clarification, they told me that I needed a doctor's note, nothing more specific than that. I had called their doctor right away. He issued me a note rather promptly, and I forwarded it to the principal. The principal then said that it needs to be forwarded to the superintendent for approval. I had asked approval for what, and she couldn't give me an answer. So a couple of days later, the superintendent got back to the principal, and the principal had called me, telling me that the note was not suffice, it was not approved, and that there needs to be a scientific medical condition written on the letter. Now, I had already been in contact with the Privacy Act of Ontario, Human Rights Legal Support, Simcoe County Public Health Unit, and not one of them, they had all told me that I do not need to specify a medical condition on the letter. So I had reached out to her back and told her all of this, and she told me that that is what I need, that my kids will not be allowed back into the school unless they have the approved note from the superintendent, and the note had to specify a scientific medical condition. She goes on to tell me, and she says, you and I both know your kids don't have a medical condition. So completely condescending, completely dismissing the medical condition that my kids do have. And she continued to hang up on me.
This is your principal.
Yep, this is the principal. So at that point, I had to start reaching out to others. The superintendent hadn't called me back yet after reaching out to him a couple times. I reached out to the Catholic trustee, Janice Hutchinson, and she had heard my side of the story and said that she needs to speak with the principal and superintendent. The superintendent called me back the next day, and he corrected what the principal had said and stated that I don't need to state a scientific medical condition, that it just needs to have the two words medical condition on there. I asked him why that was necessary, since this letter was from their family doctor. It was signed off from their family doctor for a proper mask exemption, and he said that that was policy. Nowhere on Simcoe County Public Health, the school board policy, not one place states that it has to have the words, even a medical condition, on the letter. So I don't know what he was reading off of or what he was trying to tell me, but it's not a policy. So he ended off at that, saying, you need to get that letter in.
So it sounds like they're getting really hung up on the semantics of the actual note itself here.
Yeah, they're finding, I think, any loophole that they can try and find. The next couple days after, when I had sent my kids back to school, I sent them with the original letter that I had sent into the principal that stated a mask exemption signed off by their doctor. And I told them to give this to their teacher if their teacher was questioning why they didn't have a mask on.
Mm-hmm. And these are 6 and 7-year-old children. I mean, you're asking a lot of a child to advocate for themselves against an adult here, when you as the adult aren't necessarily being respected by multiple levels of your school board, principal, and now the teachers as well.
Yes. I was scared even for my kids to go back, not knowing what was going to happen that day. But as I dropped them off, I waited to see them get into the school. And sure enough, from a distance, I saw that my son had appeared to have been stopped by a teacher. I saw him start to cry, and they had forced a mask on his face, even though the teacher was holding the medical note in her hand. So I drove up there. I got out of my car, and the teacher put her hands up into the air and was like, I didn't do anything. But, for someone that didn't do anything, she seemed to be very defensive. And I told her that you're holding the medical note in your hand right now that exempts him from a mask. And she said, oh, I didn't know, I didn't read it. So, she continued. My son, as he was told, he gave it to the teacher when he was approached regarding a mask, and the teacher didn't read it. The teacher didn't take anything into consideration and just said, you can't come into the school until you wear a mask. So my son was there, standing, looking at his feet, crying. It was such a traumatizing, thing for a parent to see. Mm-hmm. So another teacher walked him into the school, and I thought that he was going to be successfully walked to his class, no issues. But 2 minutes later, the principal and the vice principal came out to the front door and literally threw my son out the door and yelled at me, your letter is not suffice, and your son cannot be in the school without a mask. I'm not having this conversation anymore. And she slammed the door in my face.
Wow. And at this point, so you're, like I said, you're in the Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit and that school board, and that's currently in the red restrict zone. And under all of these new restrictions and guidelines, parents aren't actually allowed to enter into the school. So you're now locked out of the school with your son outside, chastised essentially for his inability to wear a mask. And what happens next?
So this was my first encounter with this principal actually ever. This is a new school for my kids as of September in 2020. And she made me feel as if there was possibly another underlying issue that she had with me. I was completely horrified by the way that my son was treated. And then to add insult to injury, he had to witness his mother being treated in such a terrible way. Regardless, my daughter had gotten inside the school. And what I had learned later was that she gave the note to her teacher, and she had been sent down to the office to get a mask. At this point, me and my son being outside, I was concerned for her well-being at this point, still being inside the school. So I rang the buzzer. I called the school multiple times, and nobody had picked up. They were ignoring me at this point. I saw teachers, custodians, delivery coming in and out. I didn't, force myself inside the school. I knew that I was respecting that was, the policy for Simcoe Muskoka right now. But I needed to get my daughter. So I kept calling, I kept ringing the buzzer. And sure enough, within about 20 minutes, a police officer pulled up to the school. And what I had learned is that the principal had called the police officer and claimed harassment. When I told the police officer all I wanted was my daughter. And if they had answered the phone, if they had answered the buzzer, they would have known that. So the police officer was kind of confused at this point as to why he was called. So he went into the school to speak to the principal, and he came out and reiterated what she said. She lied to the police. She kept telling the police officer that it's a policy that I need to show the exact medical condition on the doctor's note. And that she continued to tell the officer too that the policy is that even if my kids get medically exempt, that they will have to be placed in a room away from the other children.
So that's just straight, right, a segregation right there.
Yeah.
And all of this because you were trying to collect your daughter from school after you saw firsthand that your son was being force masked. Of course, a parent's brain is going to go there, well, what about my daughter? She's inside. I can't access inside. Is she also being force masked? Did you end up getting your daughter that day?
Yep. So the police officer had gone in and told them to bring my daughter downstairs. And my daughter
And just to point out how insane this is, it takes a police officer to have a child removed from school by their parent.
Yeah.
Like that's where we're at with the education system now, is that the police have to be called if you want to pick your child up from school.
Yes. And that's what I found. I told the police officer that this is ridiculous, that all I wanted was my daughter down because I was concerned for her safety. And the principal clearly, seems to have a personal opinion tied into this.
Yeah.
And that she is capable of anything. I asked the police officer to, if she showed him in writing any of these policies. She didn't show him in writing anything. She continued to even tell the officer that her, the superintendent, and the Simcoe County Public Health Board had a conference meeting between the three of them to discuss how this was a policy. And when I spoke to the superintendent later on, he completely denied it. And he says he doesn't have conferences regarding mask exemptions. So, I mean, the fact that the principal is saying whatever she wants to say to whoever, and, everyone is kind of dismissing her policy at this point, but yet it's still being honored. My kids were still not allowed back into the school without a mask, even with a proper mask exemption.
From your family doctor, as you've stated.
Yeah, from my family doctor.
What has this done to your children and yourself? I mean, how do you have faith in this system after this sort of situation happens?
This has been so emotionally, physically, mentally draining on my entire family. The school, we feel that was going to be a new homeschool for us. They haven't been accommodating to us at all. And we feel that they're just using bullying and exclusion tactics as a means to try to dismiss my family's rights. It's like I said, I've been given the runaround between the trustee, the superintendent, and the principal. And I have been getting nowhere. It's just a big circle.
Mm-hmm.
And later that day, when I took my kids back home, I had reached out to the superintendent again, and he reiterated the fact that the doctor's note, to be approved, it needs to have the two words medical exemption.
Right, the medical condition,
The
apparently.
medical condition,
The
yes.
semantics of now a new doctor's note. And so since that time, you've told me off camera that your doctor was reluctant at first, but is now going to grant you an additional note. And what was the grounds? What was that conversation like with your family doctor to try to get another doctor's note that states medical condition specifically?
So I think he knew at this point that the mental health of my kids and our family was being jeopardized. I didn't even have to say much other than that. I was just having a bunch of issues at the school. My kids, they can't wear a mask. And regardless of whatever the condition or the reason is, they shouldn't be made to feel isolated. They shouldn't be being taken on this mental ride.
Mm-hmm.
I feel so bad for, like, my son doesn't even want to go back to school because he's scared of being approached by any teacher at this point, not even just his own teacher, but the school. How can the school tell every single teacher about my kids and to leave them alone? I just feel that they're going to go back to school and they're going to be getting the exact same treatment that they did on that day that the police were called.
Melissa, when you get this new doctor's note, are you nervous at all what the outcome will be with the school, with the principal specifically? Do you think it will be honored? How do you think that's going to look for you?
100%. The principal's job is to make every child feel welcome and promote inclusiveness, which she hasn't done from the get-go. So now with this new note, according to the superintendent, everything should be okay. Mm-hmm. According to him, they should be exempt and there should be no other issues. But what I find is that these individuals who we're supposed to be trusting with our kids, at this point, they're finding any type of loophole to be discriminatory at this point. Mm-hmm. They are trying to find any type of reason to not honor the exemption. So I fear that when they go back, that whether they're able to go back mask-free, that they are going to be made to feel isolated, whether it's by being ripped apart from their classroom and put in a separate room away from their classmates, away from the teacher who they've had this whole year, or the principal is going to tell the teachers to make sure that my kids don't go anywhere near any other kids in the classroom, which to me, it's a severe form of bullying at that point.
Mm-hmm. And segregation. And
yes.
That is the exact opposite of the values that the schools seem to base their policies on. Maybe you want to name some names. Do you have a message for your principal specifically, the superintendent, any of the people that you have tried to advocate with at this point?
So to the principal, Sandra Reynolds, superintendent, Lonnie Bolton, Catholic trustee, Janice Hutchinson, this is something that no parent should ever have to go through. My son is so fearful to go back to school, and I'm scared that he is going to receive the same treatment because of how you guys have been treating us this whole time. I want to tell them to stop this bullying practice because at the end of the day, that's what it is. They are trying to invent policies and twisting them to fit their narrative. So with no consideration on how this is affecting our children's mental health.
Melissa, I really appreciate you coming on today and sharing your story. I hope to keep in touch with you and find out how this unfolds for yourself and your children. And I wish you all the best continuing with a hopefully trusting and caring relationship with your school principal and the school board.
Thank you. For any parents also that are going through the same thing, I want to tell them too that they need to fight for their kids, and that they're ultimately the only ones that know their children best, and to not take any discrimination or bullying from their schools. We need to keep our children safe from any harm, even if at this point the harm is coming from the people who we are supposed to trust with them daily.
Now, after Melissa and I spoke, I contacted the school board and asked if they had any sort of mask exception policy in place, and which law or policy allows for a principal to decide who is and who isn't mask exempt. I also asked if Melissa's doctor's note would be honored, and since she obviously fears that her children will now be segregated based on their mask exemption, I asked how the principal would ensure that is a non-issue. Lonnie Bolton, who's the superintendent for the school board, sent me a few links. A link to the COVID-19 reopening schools, which has a link under elementary schools, kindergarten to grade 8, titled Increased Health and Safety Measures. That link leads to the Ontario government's Guide to Reopening Schools, where it clearly states reasonable exceptions on the requirement to wear masks will apply, and further, students in kindergarten to grade 3 will be encouraged, but not required, to wear masks in indoor spaces, like Melissa's children, who are in grades 1 and 2 respectively. Further down, it states reasonable exceptions to the requirement to wear masks are expected to be put in place by schools and school boards. Staff or students with sensory or breathing difficulties may be exempted by the school principal, guided by the school board policy. Before we get to that policy, though, the superintendent also sent a link to the Simcoe-Muskoka District Health Unit for families and quoted where it states, strongly encourages masking for JKSK students who are able to tolerate it, and we support school boards and child care operators who choose to mandate masking at the JKSK level, while simultaneously ignoring the part that, quote, reasonable exemptions will apply, and then, of course, all of the other broken record repeating I've been toting for the last several months, such as who is exempt and why. And that brings us to the board policy, but wait, first, their guiding principles, such as prioritizing health and safety, just apparently not of mask-exempt individuals, supporting mental health and well-being, unless you're mask-exempt, and to consider the needs of students, staff, parents, guardians, and the community, unless, of course, they're mask-exempt. So you get the picture. On page 48 of the Muskoka District Catholic School Board policy, their school reopening plan, they outline mask exceptions. It states some considerations for mask exemptions, which include the usual clauses, again, like inability to put it on and off without assistance, refuses or can't be persuaded to wear a mask. It would inhibit their ability to breathe in any way, or for any medical or disability-related reason. Under the student procedure, it states that the parent is to provide medical documentation from a health professional that indicates a student has a medical condition that will not allow them to wear a mask. Superintendent Bolton confirmed that the Ontario Reopening Act applies to businesses or places and not schools. Instead, he refers back to the Education Act, which has key wording such as, quote, every board shall promote a positive school climate that is inclusive and accepting of all pupils, including those with disability, and that, quote, legislation and regulations governing education funding operate in a fair and non-discriminatory manner. Okay, so a doctor's note clearly fulfills the board policy, and as you know, Ms. Chaponi provided a medical note from her family physician, which has been deemed by Ms. Reynolds, that's the principal, to, quote, not suffice because the medical condition must be included in the note. What legislation is in place that allows for a principal, not a medical professional, to deem situations as reasonable? At the time of this report, Lonnie Bolton had stopped responding to my questions via email and has since followed up with Melissa, stating that her second doctor's note, which confirms a mask exemption due to medical condition, is again, quote, not sufficient information for the school to develop a plan of care or determine appropriate accommodations. He wants the doctor to, quote, provide some detail with respect to the condition that prevents your children from wearing a mask, and information would assist in developing a plan of care for their condition. They would be pleased to discuss how they can accommodate the restriction related to their condition. How about that's just none of your business? Last time I checked, access to a free public in-person education without discrimination is a basic human right. Welcome to the new normal. For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini. In order to assist you in navigating the masked exemption process, we have a special portal at maskexemption.ca. You can check out some cool swag that we have available there and all of the bylaws that are outlined, which specify who is and isn't exempt from this mandate. Head on over to maskexemption.ca to check out all of the information we've laid out there and maybe order yourself a few buttons or a masks are useless virtue signaling device. Again, that is maskexemption.ca.